What unfolded at the World Economic Forum in Davos was not just a diplomatic confrontation, it was a stress test of the global system that governs economies, jobs, and everyday life. In the span of 48 hours, the world witnessed two sharply contrasting visions of power. One emphasized cooperation, sovereignty, and stability. The other relied on pressure, threats, and transactional dominance. At the center of this clash stood Greenland, a territory suddenly transformed into a geopolitical fault line. But beneath the headlines lies a deeper question. What happens to markets, workers, and ordinary people when the rules that once restrained power begin to fracture? Davos, Greenland, and the economic shockwaves of coercive power. The Davos summit is often dismissed as a gathering of elites speaking in abstractions, but this moment cut directly into the real economy. When Donald Trump escalated threats over Greenland, invoking military force, tariffs, and economic retaliation against NATO allies, the consequences were not theoretical. Financial markets reacted almost immediately. Currency traders adjusted risk premiums. Defense stocks surged while broader equity markets dipped. Investors did what they always do when uncertainty rises. They pulled back. For Europe, the implications were severe. Denmark is not just a small NATO ally, it is deeply embedded in European supply chains. A tariff war targeting Denmark and 8 other European countries threatened to disrupt automotive manufacturing in Germany, shipping logistics in the Netherlands, aerospace production in France, and energy infrastructure across the Nordic region. Tens of thousands of jobs sit downstream from those trade links. Even the threat of disruption was enough to stall investment decisions and delay hiring across multiple sectors. In the United States, the impact was equally tangible. Trump's tariff threats against European allies risked retaliation against American exports, particularly in agriculture, machinery, and high-end manufacturing. Farmers who had only recently stabilized after previous trade conflicts faced renewed uncertainty. Manufacturing firms dependent on European components confronted rising costs. When markets dipped following Trump's remarks, American pension funds, tied to stock performance, absorbed the shock. For ordinary Americans, this translated into retirement accounts losing value and employers tightening budgets. Greenland itself became an economic symbol far larger than its population. The island holds vast mineral resources, rare earth elements, uranium, and critical materials essential for renewable energy and advanced technology. But development in Greenland has always been cautious, tied to environmental protection and local consent. Trump's rhetoric reframed these resources not as shared economic opportunities, but as assets to be seized. That shift rattled international investors who rely on predictability and legal stability. Capital does not flow easily into regions where sovereignty appears negotiable. This is where Mark Carney's speech landed with such force. By declaring the post-war economic order over, he gave language to what markets were already signaling. The rules-based system, however imperfect, provided businesses with guardrails. Contracts mattered. Borders were respected. Trade disputes were slow, legalistic, and predictable. Remove those assumptions, and every investment becomes a gamble. Carney warned that integration without protection leads to subordination, a reality multinational firms and mid-sized economies have begun to internalize. Employment sits at the center of this rupture. When trade relationships destabilize, companies respond by freezing hiring, shifting operations, or accelerating automation. Workers rarely see these decisions framed as geopolitical. They experience them as layoffs, reduced hours, or stalled wage growth. In Europe, unions warned that a prolonged confrontation with Washington could cost tens of thousands of industrial jobs. In Canada, Carney's home country, policymakers quietly prepared contingency plans for export disruption, particularly in energy and manufacturing. The psychological impact on people's lives is harder to measure, but no less real. Economic uncertainty erodes trust, not just in markets, but in institutions. When allies threaten one another, citizens begin questioning the reliability of long-standing partnerships. Businesses hesitate to expand. Young workers delay major life decisions, buying homes, starting families, because the future feels unstable. This is how geopolitical tension trickles down into kitchens and living rooms. Trump's eventual retreat at Davos, announcing a vague framework and ruling out military force, temporarily calmed markets. Stocks rebounded, currencies stabilized, but the damage was not erased. Investors understood that the volatility itself was the message. If threats could escalate so quickly against allies, they could return just as fast. The framework offered no binding guarantees, no enforcement mechanisms, and no clarity on long-term policy. It was a pause, not a resolution. What Europe demonstrated in response was economically significant. By unifying, politically and militarily, European states signaled to markets that they could collectively absorb pressure. Unity reduced risk. It reassured investors that no single country would be isolated and crushed economically. This collective stance protected jobs, stabilized trade expectations, and preserved consumer confidence. It also sent a message beyond Europe. Economic resilience now depends on cooperation among middle powers, not deference to a single dominant actor. This is the real economic story of Davos, not speeches or sound bites, but the exposure of a fragile system where coercion creates volatility, and volatility punishes workers first. Greenland was never just about territory. It became a warning shot across the global economy, showing how quickly livelihoods can be placed at risk when power abandons restraint, employment, sovereignty, and the human cost of a fracturing world order. While markets react in minutes, the impact on employment unfolds more slowly and far more painfully. What the Greenland confrontation revealed is how deeply modern jobs depend on political stability and mutual restraint. When Trump framed Greenland as a negotiable asset and treated NATO allies as leverage targets, he wasn't just challenging diplomats. He was destabilizing the invisible scaffolding that supports millions of workers across Europe and North America. Consider the defense escalation first. When European nations deployed troops to Greenland for joint exercises, governments insisted this was about deterrence, not provocation. But defense mobilization carries economic trade-offs. Resources shift, budgets are reallocated. Funds that might have gone to infrastructure, education, or social services are redirected towards security. For workers in civilian sectors, that often means delayed public projects, hiring freezes, or reduced government support. Militarization, even when defensive, reshapes labor priorities. In Denmark, the stakes were immediate. Greenland's status is constitutionally tied to Copenhagen, and any threat to its sovereignty becomes a national economic issue. Shipping firms worried about Arctic trade routes. Energy companies faced uncertainty over future exploration rights. Tourism operators feared reputational damage as Greenland was recast in global media as a conflict zone rather than a destination. Each of these sectors employs real people, dock workers, engineers, service staff, whose incomes depend on calm, not confrontation. Across the European Union, the employment picture grew more complex. Trump's tariff threats targeted multiple countries simultaneously, creating a sense of collective vulnerability. Automotive plants in Germany rely on components that cross borders multiple times before final assembly. Aerospace manufacturing in France and the UK depends on transatlantic certification and regulatory alignment. Even rumors of trade barriers force companies to run worst-case scenarios. In those scenarios, job cuts are not political statements, they are accounting decisions. For American workers, the story mirrored Europe's in uncomfortable ways. Trump's posture promised strength, but strength built on coercion creates instability at home. When European leaders signaled they would retaliate economically if tariffs were imposed, U.S. exporters faced shrinking access to one of their largest markets. Farmers, already bruised by earlier trade wars, saw futures contracts wobble. Manufacturing workers heard familiar language from management. We're waiting to see how this plays out. What made this moment different was the erosion of trust. Workers can adapt to competition. They can even adapt to gradual decline. What they struggle with is unpredictability. When policy appears driven by impulse rather than strategy, long-term planning becomes impossible. Apprenticeships are delayed, training budgets are cut, career ladders shorten. Over time, this hollows out entire industries. This is where Mark Carney's argument about useful fictions intersects directly with people's lives. For decades, workers believed, often implicitly, that globalization, however unequal, followed rules. That belief justified sacrifice. Jobs moved overseas, but stability remained. Wages stagnated, but supply chains held. Carney's warning was stark. When integration turns into subordination, workers pay twice, once through lost autonomy and again through lost security. Greenland symbolized that shift. Its people were largely absent from Trump's rhetoric, reduced to a strategic variable. That omission mattered. When communities see themselves treated as assets rather than stakeholders, resistance hardens. Greenland's leaders made clear that mineral development would proceed only on their terms. That stance resonated globally, especially in regions where local labor has historically been exploited under the banner of strategic necessity. The European response to Trump's threats offered an alternative employment narrative. By acting together, EU states reduced the likelihood that any single workforce would bear the full cost of retaliation. Collective defense extended beyond military coordination into economic shielding. It signaled that jobs, industries, and communities would be defended as part of sovereignty itself. This reframing matters. Employment is no longer just an economic issue, it is a strategic one. Yet the cost of this transition should not be underestimated. Building strategic autonomy means duplicating supply chains, reshoring production, and reducing dependency. In the short term, that raises costs. Consumers pay higher prices. Governments subsidize industries. Workers face retraining. But leaders calculated that controlled disruption was preferable to coerced dependency. That calculation reflects a world where stability is no longer guaranteed by hierarchy. For ordinary people, this moment felt like standing on shifting ground. News headlines spoke of frameworks and summits, but the underlying message was simpler and more unsettling. The old protections may not hold. Alliances can be tested. Jobs can become bargaining chips. And the rules that once moderated power are no longer reliable. Trump's climb down at Davos slowed the immediate damage, but it did not reverse the trend. Workers understand this instinctively. They watch companies hedge, governments rearm, and leaders speak in the language of resilience rather than growth. The employment landscape is adjusting to a harsher reality, one where security is collective, volatility is constant, and livelihoods depend on whether cooperation can outpace coercion. Everyday life, market psychology, and the long shadow of uncertainty. If markets react in minutes and employment shifts over months, the deepest impact of the Davos confrontation unfolds quietly in everyday life. This is where geopolitics stops being abstract and becomes personal. The Greenland crisis, and Trump's reluctant retreat from it, exposed a reality that ordinary people increasingly feel but rarely hear articulated clearly. Instability at the top filters downward, reshaping daily decisions, expectations, and trust in the future. When Trump threatened military action and tariffs against allies, the immediate financial reaction was volatility. But volatility is not just a chart movement. It is a signal that ripples through households. Pension funds tied to equity markets dipped. Insurance firms reassessed geopolitical risk. Banks tightened lending standards, even slightly, in response to uncertainty. For families, that translated into higher borrowing costs, stricter mortgage approvals, and fewer credit options. These changes rarely make headlines, but they accumulate. Consumer confidence is especially sensitive to international tension. When people hear that the President of the United States is openly threatening allies, something fundamental shifts. They may not follow the details of NATO or Greenland's legal status, but they understand risk. They delay major purchases. They hold on to savings. They become cautious. Retail spending softens. Small businesses feel the pressure first. Restaurants, contractors, local service providers whose margins depend on steady demand. In Europe, the psychological impact was compounded by history. For decades, NATO represented certainty. Even during disagreements, the alliance was assumed to be unbreakable. Trump's posture shattered that assumption. When European leaders openly discussed the possibility of invoking Article 5 against the United States itself, the shock was profound. It forced citizens to confront an unsettling thought. Protection is no longer automatic. Security must be prepared for, even among friends. This shift has consequences for social cohesion. Governments responding to uncertainty emphasize resilience, preparedness, and autonomy. Those are rational strategies, but they come with trade-offs. Public messaging becomes more somber. Budgets prioritize defense and strategic industries over social expansion. People are asked to accept higher costs today in exchange for safety tomorrow. Not everyone agrees on the balance, and political tensions rise accordingly. Trump's declaration of a framework deal temporarily eased these anxieties, but only on the surface. People notice the vagueness, they notice the absence of firm commitments, and they notice the pattern. This was not the first time a crisis had been escalated and then diffused without resolution. Over time, repeated cycles like this erode trust. Citizens begin to assume that stability is temporary, that calm is provisional. Mark Carney's speech resonated precisely because it acknowledged this lived reality. He did not promise comfort. He did not claim the system could be restored with minor adjustments. He named the rupture. In doing so, he validated what people were already experiencing, a sense that the ground rules have changed. That honesty, paradoxically, provided reassurance. Clarity reduces anxiety more effectively than false optimism. The contrast with Trump's worldview was stark. Trump framed strength as dominance, the ability to extract concessions through pressure. But for ordinary people, dominance without predictability feels like danger, not security. A system where power is exercised impulsively forces everyone else to adapt defensively. That adaptation shows up in daily life as caution, stress, and disengagement. The Greenland episode also reshaped how people think about sovereignty. For small nations and communities, watching Europe stand firm mattered. It suggested that resistance is possible, that collective action can constrain even the most powerful actors. This lesson extended beyond Europe. In Asia, Latin America, and Africa, policymakers and citizens alike observed the episode closely. The takeaway was not anti-American sentiment, but a recalibration of expectations. Dependence carries risks. Diversification offers protection. Markets internalize the same lesson. After the initial rebound following Trump's retreat, analysts revised long-term forecasts. Risk premiums on U.S.-centric supply chains increased. Companies accelerated plans to regionalize production. These decisions affect prices, availability, and employment. Not dramatically overnight, but steadily. Consumers feel it as higher costs and fewer choices. Workers feel it as changing skill demands and shifting job locations. Perhaps the most enduring impact is emotional. Living through repeated geopolitical shocks creates fatigue. People disengage from news. Cynicism grows. When leaders speak of frameworks and victories, audiences listen skeptically. This erosion of credibility is difficult to reverse. It weakens democratic accountability and opens space for extremism, as people search for certainty in simplified narratives. The Davos moment did not resolve these tensions. It revealed them. Trump's retreat reduced immediate danger, but it confirmed that escalation is always one decision away. Carney's vision offered a path forward, but it requires sustained cooperation and political courage. For ordinary people, the question is not abstract. Will this new world produce stability they can plan their lives around, or endless uncertainty they must endure? That question remains unanswered. But after Davos, one thing is clear. Power no longer guarantees obedience. And when that reality sets in, everyday life, from jobs to prices to peace of mind, is irrevocably changed. What this moment means going forward. The Davos confrontation over Greenland was not an isolated incident. It was a signal that the old assumptions about power, obedience, and stability no longer hold. Trump arrived seeking dominance and left having revealed limits. Europe arrived divided and left unified. And in between, millions of people felt the tremors through markets, prices, and confidence in the future. The question now is whether this moment becomes a turning point or the warning ignored. Can cooperation outpace coercion? Can middle powers protect stability without escalation? And most importantly, how should societies respond when the rules change faster than everyday lives can adapt? Share your thoughts, because this debate is no longer theoretical, it's personal.